Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night settles quietly over the silent empires, where loyalty is fragile and power moves in the softest shadows. Tonight, we turn to Ralph Natale, the sharp-minded boss whose calm presence and quiet determination reshaped Philadelphia's underworld from the inside out. His story isn't told with noise, it unfolds through silent moves, calculated alliances, and a lifetime spent navigating the darkest corners of organized crime. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, slow your breathing, and let the story of Ralph Natale guide you deeper into the quiet. An old man in a plain suburban house poured himself a glass of water and sat beside a window that faced nothing in particular. Neighbors knew him as a quiet retiree who rarely spoke about his past. Yet in courtrooms, in thick files kept by federal agents, and in a memoir that stunned many who had followed American organized crime, that same man appeared under another name, Ralph Natale, one-on-time boss of the Philadelphia, South Jersey crime family, the first sitting American mafia leader to cooperate fully with the government. For decades, his decisions had shaped lives on streets lined with row houses and neon bar signs. He helped control unions, gambling, narcotics, and loan sharking, and he later admitted to taking part in deadly violence. What follows is his story from the beginning, not as glamour, but as a long, cautionary path that started with a boy in South Philadelphia who thought power would fill every empty space inside him. Ralph Natale was born on the 6th of March 1935 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a tight Italian-American enclave where families crowded into small brick homes and everyone seemed to know each other's business. The city was still climbing out of the hardships of the Depression and the strain of the Second World War. In those neighborhoods, a boy quickly noticed the gap between men who worked themselves to exhaustion for modest pay and others who wore better suits, slipped into dark cars, and never seemed to worry about bills. Those better-addressed men carried a certain respect. People stepped aside for them on sidewalks and lowered their voices when they passed. His family, like many immigrant families, emphasized loyalty, hard work, and respect for elders. Church bells, smell of cooking from open windows, and the sound of arguments spoken in rapid Italian filled his days. At the same time, the area already had a strong underworld presence. Gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets quietly threaded through everyday life. Kids learned street rules early. Mind your own affairs, don't talk to police, and know which corners belong to which crew. By his own later accounts, Natale was restless from a young age. School never held his attention. The discipline and small rewards of regular work didn't impress him. He was drawn toward men who seemed to command fear and admiration. Philadelphia in those years was the turf of the local mafia family, later known as the Bruno crime family, after longtime boss Angelo Bruno. Under Bruno were soldiers and associates who ran bars, clubs, and gambling dens, and who managed labor unions. Among them was a feared figure named Felix Skinny Razor DeTullio, a man whose nickname came from both his slender frame and his reputation for cold efficiency. Natale would later describe Skinny Razor as a crucial early influence. As a teenager and young man, he hung close to bars and social clubs controlled by DeTullio's circle. Simple errands turned into small favors, and small favors turned into informal work. In that world, young men proved themselves not by good grades or regular promotions, but by silence, courage under pressure, and willingness to do what older men asked without argument. The first steps into that life often looked harmless. A young associate might watch a door at a card game, carry envelopes, or deliver messages so that older men didn't have to expose themselves. In communities like South Philadelphia, those tasks came wrapped in the language of family and respect. Men called each other uncle, cousin, even when they were not related. For a boy like Ralph, that sense of belonging and importance was powerful. He was no longer just another face in a crowded row house. He was part of an inside circle. As he moved into his late teens and early 20s, Natale became more deeply involved with DeTullio's crew and other members of the local crime family. Law enforcement records from later years and testimony by investigators describe him as an upwand-coming figure connected to both street operations and union activities. Philadelphia's bars, restaurants, and hotels relied on bartenders and service staff who belonged to labor unions. Those unions, in many cities, attracted underworld attention because they provided a way to control jobs, benefits, pension funds, and strike decisions. Whoever influenced the union could pressure business owners, steer contracts, and skim money without drawing much notice at first. Natale gravitated toward that side of things. He learned how to work inside union halls, where official speeches about workers' rights mixed with quiet backroom decisions about who would get which posts and which companies received contracts. He would eventually hold leadership roles in a bartenders' union, organizing and representing hospitality workers. On paper, that made him a labor advocate. Behind the scenes, it asked for allegiances that went far beyond normal union politics. For men tied to the underworld, unions worked like levers. A threatened strike could push a business owner into paying underworth table money to keep peace. A man who wanted a promotion might deliver cash or favors to leaders connected with organized crime. Natale came to see how paperwork, votes, and official meetings could become tools for extortion and theft as effectively as any weapon, all while appearing legitimate from the outside. At the same time, he was exposed to the violent side of that world. While he would not grow into a widely known figure until later decades, accounts from prosecutors and his own later testimony indicate that even in his younger years he was close to people who settled disputes with intimidation and, when ordered, deadly force. In that culture, violence was discussed not as random cruelty but as business, or taking care of a problem. That way of speaking made serious crimes feel almost routine. The Philadelphia crime family during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds under Angelo Bruno had a reputation, compared with some other cities, for favoring quiet money over noisy bloodshed. Bruno preferred stable earnings from gambling, loans, and unions to open warfare. Yet discipline still depended on the possibility of harsh punishment. Natale grew within that structure. He learned that decisions flowed from the top down, and that those who followed orders could rise. Those who talked out of turn, stole from the organization, or defied the boss risked being permanently removed. Natale's personal life weaved in and out of this environment. Like many men of his background, he married young and started a family. Outwardly, he was a husband and father, involved in the same city rhythms as countless others: dinners at home, family gatherings, Sunday church services. Inwardly, he was deeply entangled in labor racketeering and underworld business. Friends and neighbors might have suspected, but in that era, many people in those neighborhoods chose not to see too much. Silence was a protective habit. He began to build a reputation as someone who could be trusted to carry out instructions and maintain loyalty under pressure. Federal agents who later investigated the Philadelphia mob described Natale as a serious, determined operator, rather than a flashy street hood. He wasn't known for wild partying or constant public displays. Instead, he learned to move between social worlds: the union office, the bar back room, the neighborhood street corner, and family gatherings. By the late 1,960 seconds, his deepening involvement brought him closer to criminal schemes that mixed business, corruption, and intimidation. Illegal lending at high interest, protection payments from bar owners, and influence over which companies supplied certain services all generated money that flowed upward through the ranks. Natale played a role in ensuring that payments came on time, and that those who resisted felt enough pressure to reconsider. While most accounts from that era describe him more as an enforcer and organizer than a public face of the family, he was clearly moving beyond the level of a simple errand runner. One major area where he later admitted wrongdoing was arson tied to insurance fraud and business pressure. In later court proceedings and interviews, Natale acknowledged that during his earlier years in the mob, he had taken part in plots to set fire to properties when it served the interests of his superiors or associates. Sometimes owners wanted to collect insurance money on failing businesses. Other times fires were used as warnings or punishments. He spoke about arranging such acts, though the specific details and number of incidents remain part of dense case files and his own often dramatic retellings. What is clear is that he crossed lines from intimidation into serious property crimes long before he became a boss. Law enforcement attention followed, As federal agencies grew more sophisticated in tracking organized crime during the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, they began to piece together the links between union officials, mob families, and violent acts. Natale appeared in investigative reports as a significant figure in the bartenders' union scene and a reliable associate of respected mob leaders. Being important in that world meant more influence and money, but it also meant that investigators began keeping closer watch. At some point, those overlapping worlds led to his first major criminal convictions. In the early 1970 seconds, he was prosecuted in connection with an arson scheme tied to insurance fraud. He was found guilty and sent to prison. That conviction marked a turning point. Up to then, much of his wrongdoing had been hidden behind social respectability and union titles. Now, there was a public record. A union man from South Philadelphia had gone to federal prison for serious crime. Prison did not break his ties to organized crime. For many mob figures, time behind bars functioned almost like an extended meeting ground. Men from different crews and even different cities crossed paths, shared information, and planned for the day they would go back out. Natale served his sentence, kept up his underworld connections, and, according to various accounts, emerged with his loyalty to the Philadelphia family still intact. When he returned to the streets, the world had changed. The late 1970 seconds brought new fortunes and new dangers for organized crime in Philadelphia. Leadership struggles, internal resentments, and outside pressures were beginning to stir beneath the surface of Angelo Bruno's apparently calm rule. Natale stepped back into a scene where money from narcotics, especially methamphetamine, tempted men who had previously focused on gambling and unions. That temptation would soon draw him into even more serious criminal territory, and eventually into another, longer prison term that shaped everything that came after. When the 1970 seconds rolled forward, the city around Ralph Natale began to change in ways that magnified everything he was already part of. Atlantic City, a short drive from his old South Philadelphia blocks, legalized casino gambling. Developers rushed in with big money, hotels rose along the boardwalk, and the underworld saw a fresh opportunity. Construction contracts, union jobs in casinos, and tourist cash gave men like Natale new reasons to tighten their grip on labor and hospitality work. He already held influence in the bartenders' union, and that position allowed him to steer hiring, control which bars stayed on good terms with organized labor, and put pressure on owners who hesitated to cooperate. A threatened walkout could empty cocktail lounges and gaming floors. Even the rumor of trouble, whispered in the right ears, could bring business owners to the table ready to pay for peace. What outsiders called shakedowns were described inside the circle as insurance or arrangements, words that made everything sound almost respectable. Alongside that, he continued enforcing debts and resolving disputes for his higher-ups. By the standards of that world, he had arrived. No longer a kid fetching coffee, but a trusted fixer who could call on men for jobs, deliver messages from important figures, and move in spaces where police and reporters couldn't easily follow. Yet the cost of that upward climb grew heavier. In later court testimony, he admitted that during these years he had participated in killings ordered by superiors. Targets included men suspected of stealing from the organization, refusing orders, or talking with authorities. The acts were carried out in alleys, cars, and quiet meeting spots, planned so that they looked like personal disputes or robberies gone wrong. Natale described luring some victims into believing they were going to settle problems, only for them to be ambushed instead. Publicly, these deaths often blended into general urban crime. But inside the underworld, they functioned as reminders. When people heard that a man had vanished or been found dead after crossing the wrong people, they didn't ask many questions. Natale's willingness to follow through when superiors demanded the ultimate punishment strengthened his standing. It also fixed his path. Once you had taken lives at the direction of a criminal organization, walking away was almost impossible. Even as he deepened his involvement in that hidden violence, money from more traditional rackets still drove Dayu to business. Gambling operations flourished in back rooms and private clubs, loan sharking, where desperate borrowers paid steep interest under threat of retaliation, filled envelopes that moved upward. Natale watched cash flow from neighborhood bars to union halls, and then into the hands of higher bosses. It felt to him then like belonging to a powerful machine. But another stream of money began to tempt ambitious men: synthetic narcotics, law enforcement accounts, and later testimony describe how, during the 1,970 seconds, some members of the Philadelphia mob and associated crews began producing and selling methamphetamine. It could be made in hidden labs, transported in plain containers, and sold at large profit margins. For those already involved in gambling and union schemes, it looked like the next big step. Natale entered that trade, connecting with people who knew how to produce the drug and with street distributors who could move it. By his own later admissions, he helped oversee operations that produced and sold significant amounts. He justified it at the time the way many in his position did. Others would sell it anyway, so he might as well control it and reap the profit. That reasoning ignored the growing damage on the streets. Addictions spread, families fractured, and neighborhoods faced a new kind of trouble more destructive than the old numbers games. Dealing in narcotics drew intense attention from federal agents. The Drug Enforcement Administration and FBI had begun devoting major resources to tracking supply chains. Undercover agents, informants, and wiretaps probed networks that once felt immune. Natale, who had long operated with a sense of security in his neighborhood, now faced investigators watching from unmarked cars and listening from hidden microphones. At the same time, he remained connected to traditional mob circles around boss Angelo Bruno. Bruno valued steady earnings and generally discouraged loud conflicts or reckless behavior that might attract attention. However, his leadership faced pressure from men who wanted faster, riskier profits, and more aggressive methods. Tensions that had boiled quietly for years finally erupted in 1980, when Bruno was shot to death while sitting in his car outside a cousin's home. That killing shook the Philadelphia underworld. A figure regarded as calm and calculating was suddenly gone, and everyone understood that his death had not been random. Natale, though already under watch for his own activities, took in the news with a mixture of anger, unease, and curiosity. Power struggles after a longtime boss fell could make or break careers. They could also get people killed. The aftermath of Bruno's assassination was complicated. Different accounts and court findings point to internal scheming involving higher-ranking members who hoped to take over. New York mob leaders eventually punished some of the conspirators, sending a message that unauthorized kills at that level would not be tolerated. But closer to home, the death opened space for a more ruthless figure to rise. Nicodemo, Little Nicky. Scarfo, a man known for quick temper and harsh approach. Scarfo's era, beginning in the early 1980 seconds, turned Philadelphia into one of the most volatile mafia territories in the country. Under his rule, disputes inside the crime family frequently ended in slayings rather than quiet compromise. Those who questioned his authority or even appeared disloyal risked fatal consequences. Street tales from that time describe how routine arguments over money, territory, or perceived disrespect could escalate swiftly. Natale had known Scarfo for years. Both men had roots in South Philadelphia and South Jersey, and both had spent time building influence around unions and gambling. During Bruno's time, Scarfo had been considered something of an outcast, partly because of his temperament. Now, with Bruno gone and rivals neutralized, Scarfo seized control and rewarded loyal allies. Natale's connections to him would matter, even as Natale's own legal troubles deepened. Federal investigations into methamphetamine trafficking and union corruption finally caught up with him. In the late 1970 seconds, he was convicted in connection with an arson plot aimed at collecting insurance and pressuring business interests. That case alone was serious, but authorities were not finished. In the early 1980 seconds, they brought major narcotics charges, accusing Natale and others of running a significant methamphetamine production and distribution ring. Faced with strong evidence, including testimony from insiders and seized materials, he was convicted. The resulting prison sentence stretched well beyond a few years. Across multiple cases, he ended up serving a long federal term that kept him behind bars through most of the prawns part for most of the resulting 1980 seconds and into the early 1990 seconds. That confinement represented a harsh shift. One day he had been a man who could walk into bars and union halls with authority. The next he was just another inmate, subject to counts, searches, and rigid schedules. Inside, though, his past did not disappear. In many prisons, especially at that time, known organized crime figures gravitated toward one another for protection and company. Natale's reputation as a loyal mob man and enforcer gave him status among a certain crowd. He kept track of events on the outside through visits, letters, and conversations with newcomers who had just been arrested. He learned how Scarfo's reign had made Philadelphia notorious even compared with other mob cities. Internal wars, attacks on perceived traitors, and disputes with rival factions left a trail of bodies. Law enforcement responded by focusing extraordinary attention on the Scarfo regime. Wiretaps on key members, undercover stings, and flipped insiders slowly built powerful cases. In the late 1980s, Scarfo and several of his top associates were convicted on racketeering and other serious charges, effectively collapsing his hold on the family. From his cell, Natale watched these developments unfold piece by piece. The old structure he had known when he went inside the stable Bruno era, the early moves toward narcotics, the first hints of power shifts was gone. In its place stood a battered organization, its leadership imprisoned or dead, its earning power damaged by constant internal conflict and law enforcement scrutiny. That kind of vacuum invited new players. In the early 1990s, even as he remained locked up, younger Philadelphia figures began vying for control. One of them was Joseph "Joey" Merlino, the son of a respected mobster from an earlier generation. Merlino and his friends were part of a younger wave that came of age during Scarfo's turbulent period. They had seen both the money and the violence up close and were determined to shape their own future. Natale crossed paths with Merlino in prison. Accounts from investigators, and from both men, later describe how their relationship grew during shared time behind bars. Natale, older and steeped in the traditions of the mafia, acted as a kind of mentor. He talked about the old codes, loyalty, discretion, paying tribute to superiors, while also sharing stories of past operations. To younger inmates, he carried the aura of someone who had stood close to famous bosses, run profitable rackets, and survived serious cases without ever testifying against colleagues. Merlino, energetic and ambitious, impressed Natale with his boldness and charm. He seemed able to win followers easily, especially among men from South Philadelphia, who resented how Scarfo's years of fear had destroyed many families. Together, the older inmate and the younger man began to imagine how the Philadelphia family might be reshaped once they were both free. According to later court testimony, they discussed alliances, potential rivalries, and ways to reclaim profitable rackets from weakened or aging figures on the outside. During this same period, other leaders attempted to rebuild the organization. A Sicilian-born figure named John Stanfa emerged in the early 1990s, with backing from some New York interests, as a would-be stabilizing boss. However, those efforts met resistance from Merlino's circle, leading to violent clashes in the streets, drivings, shootings, ambushes at intersections, and attempts on lives that once again filled the news. Natale watched these developments with interest, knowing that when he returned home he would be stepping into a scene filled with fresh grudges and wounded pride. Prison life hardened him in other ways too. While inside, he had to navigate not only his own criminal past, but also the daily pressures of confinement, conflicts among inmates, racial tensions, strict routines, and the constant presence of guards. Yet he managed to maintain a sense of purpose by clinging to his identity as a made man and future player. Unlike inmates without outside networks, he felt certain that when the gates finally opened, he would still matter. He did not change his view of his past, at least not openly. By all available accounts, during those years he remained proud of his role in the underworld, saw violence as a necessary part of business, and dismissed government efforts to break the mob as temporary obstacles. He had not yet reached the turning point that would later make him famous as a witness. Instead, he was planning a comeback. As his release date approached in the early to mid-1990s, Philadelphia's underworld stood worn down yet not destroyed. Scarfo and his core people were serving long sentences. Stanfa, too, would face his own racketeering conviction, further splintering the leadership picture. Younger groups associated with Merlino continued pushing for control, presenting themselves as a new chapter after the Scarfo chaos. Money from illegal gambling, sports betting, and loan sharking still flowed through the city, though not at the level of earlier decades. Drugs remained lucrative, but drew intense police focus. Into that uncertain environment, Ralph Natale prepared to return. He was no longer a street-level tough from the union halls, but an older man in his late 50s, hardened by many years inside and carrying stories of past bosses and wars. He had served his time without cutting deals, which still carried weight in mob culture. He had a close alliance with Joey Merlino, who was already positioning himself as a key force in the city, and he carried an ambition that had not dimmed with age, to sit at the top of a crime family that had spent years tearing itself apart. When he finally left prison and stepped again onto free pavement, he entered a Philadelphia that felt both familiar and new. The row houses, the corner bars, the churches were still there, but the balance of power on those streets had shifted. Each decision he made now, each alliance he reinforced or broke, would shape not only his own fate but the future of organized crime in the region, and eventually, it would push him toward a decision no American mafia boss before him had ever taken. The morning Ralph walked out of prison, the air felt strange on his face. Years of recycled indoor air had dulled his senses. Now, the sky seemed too open, the traffic too loud. The city almost unfamiliar. He had gone in as a strong man in his 40s and returned in his late 50s, hair thinner, joints stiffer, but his mind still fixed on the same idea. He would not come back as a nobody. He had paid his dues. In his world, that meant he had earned a higher place. Waiting on the outside was the young man he had spent so many hours talking with in the yard and on the tiers, Joey Merlino. Merlino was quick a smiling, stylish, and already a known figure on the streets of South Philadelphia. He had followed his father into the life and then tried to carve out his own path in the chaos after Scarfo and Stanfa. Younger men gravitated to him. To them, he looked like the future. To older men still around, though, Joey and his friends seemed wild. They liked flashy clothes, noisy nights out, and public attention. That went against the old rule of staying in the shadows. In that sense, Ralph and Joey came from different eras, yet the bond formed in prison gave them common ground. Ralph saw in Joey energy and reach. Joey saw in Ralph experience and credibility with older mobsters and with the New York families whose opinions still mattered. After a few private meetings in cars and back rooms, they agreed on a structure that suited both of them. Ralph would be presented as the official boss of the Philadelphia South Jersey organization. His age, prison record, and long history with respected figures made that believable. New York leaders who preferred the old ways felt more comfortable dealing with a calm older man than with a brash, younger street figure. Joey, meanwhile, would run day-to-day operations, controlling his own crew and much of the cash flow, while publicly showing deference to Ralph as the top man. For Ralph, the arrangement held appeal. After decades as an enforcer, fixer, and union man, he could finally sit in the chair he had watched others occupy. He could call meetings where people waited for his words, take tribute from crews, and speak as the voice of the family to other cities. He saw himself as a stabilizer after years of bloodshed. In his mind, he would bring back a version of the quieter Angelo Bruno era, while still taking advantage of newer money sources. His first job was to pull scattered operations into some kind of order. The wars under Scarfo and Stanfa had splintered rackets. Bookmakers paid different people. Some bar owners tried to stay independent, hoping the mob was finished. Union influence had weakened as leaders were jailed or driven out. Ralph began visiting trusted old contacts, either in person or through respected intermediaries, reminding them who had always protected them and suggesting that, if they wanted calm, they should return to paying regular rent to the family. Those payments came from several streams. Illegal sports betting still flourished in Philadelphia, especially around professional football and basketball seasons. Bookmakers took bets and, in exchange for protection and the right to operate, handed over a portion of profits. Loan sharking continued. Money lent at high rates to people and businesses in trouble, with collection enforced through pressure and, when necessary, threats. Bars, restaurants, and clubs paid to avoid labor trouble or vandalism. Some strip clubs and after-hours spots kicked in weekly or monthly envelopes. Ralph also renewed his interest in union activity, especially around bartenders and hospitality workers. His past in that world remained useful. He knew which officials were open to deals, which contractors depended on union cooperation, and how to use the threat of strikes or slowdowns to bring money to the table. On the surface, meetings might focus on wages, benefits, and contracts. Behind closed doors, side conversations turned to under-the-table payments, no-show jobs, and control of pension funds. In South Jersey and Atlantic City, he and his people looked for opportunities in the casino world. They tried to influence which companies supplied certain services, linen, food, security, and to steer union jobs. Anything touching construction, trucking, or service work could be nudged their way if the right official owed a favor or feared a conflict. None of this showed up in glossy tourist brochures. To visitors playing blackjack or walking the boardwalk, it was invisible. But inside back offices, those pressures were real. At the same time, Ralph's past and his new role meant he could not completely avoid serious violence. In later testimony, he admitted that as boss, he had approved or helped plan lethal attacks on people seen as threats to his group's stability or profits. Targets included men suspected of helping rival factions, refusing to share earnings, or talking with law enforcement. Orders moved through layers. A trusted captain would be told to take care of a problem, and that captain would assign shooters or lurers. The actual events took place on dark streets, in parking lots near highway ramps, places chosen to reduce witnesses. He insisted afterward that he never acted out of personal rage, only so-called business. But that distinction offered little comfort to families left without fathers, brothers, or sons. Each incident widened circles of fear and grief, even if newspapers only printed a few paragraphs under bland headlines. Inside the organization, though, these actions had immediate effect. After years of open warfare, many lower-level members wanted stability more than anything. Knowing that a firm hand sat at the top reassured some of them. The idea was simple. If everyone followed the rules, kicked up money, stayed loyal, kept quiet, then the boss would manage disputes and keep outside chaos to a minimum. Ralph liked to see himself as that manager. He held sit-downs where warring bookmakers aired grievances. He listened as bar owners argued over who had rights to supply certain machines or games. He decided which crew controlled which stretch of territory, sometimes forcing younger men to back off areas they had entered aggressively. In those rooms, his age worked in his favor. Men who might challenge a younger leader often hesitated to shout down a man old enough to be their father. Yet trouble brewed under the surface. The very thing that made Joey useful, his stronghold over an energetic young circle, also made him difficult to control. Joey enjoyed the attention that came with being recognized in nightclubs and at public events. He posed for photos, talked openly with reporters at times, and projected the image of a neighborhood celebrity. That clash with the old commandment of staying invisible bothered Ralph. To Ralph's thinking, every newspaper photo, every loud public scene, made investigations more likely. The more gossip spread about Joey's lifestyle, the more federal agents listened. And they were listening. The FBI and other agencies, determined not to let Philadelphia slip back into old patterns, had concentrated resources on the city's underworld. They knew about the new alliance between the older exo-convict and the younger street leader. They were just waiting for a way inside. That chance came through a man who seemed, at first, like the perfect recruit for the Merlino-Natale partnership, Ron Previght. Previtt had once worn a police badge in New Jersey, then left that career and gravitated into the rackets. Big in size and personality, he drove trucks, collected debts, and acted as muscle for various operators. To Ralph and Joey, he looked like the kind of rough worker any crew needed, streetwise, unafraid, and connected to both labor and trucking. They brought him closer, giving him jobs to test his reliability. He collected payments, delivered messages, and joined conversations about business. Over time, he appeared more and more often at key tables. Ralph, who prided himself on reading people, accepted him as a loyal earner. So did Joey. What they didn't know was that before fully joining their inner circle, Previght had started working with the FBI. Agents, aware of his background and financial troubles, had approached him. They offered a choice: face charges or cooperate. He chose cooperation. They equipped him with recording devices small enough to hide on his body or in objects he carried, and sent him back into meetings with Ralph and Joey. The recordings he gathered over months, and then years, gave investigators a rare inside look at the organization's routines. Ralph talked on tape about extortion of bookmakers, pressure on bar owners, and plans to collect more money from Atlantic City interests. There were discussions about sports betting, loan payments, and expectations for tribute from crews. Even when he tried to speak in code, patterns emerged. Sometimes, Ralph's temper flared when he felt he wasn't receiving enough respect or money. Those outbursts added color to the files federal agents were building against him. Previte also recorded Joey, whose casual approach often led him to speak more freely than older figures ever would have. Together, those recordings formed the backbone of future racketeering cases. Each envelope counted, each call monitored, each partial phrase slowly filled in the picture of how the new regime worked. Meanwhile, on the surface, life rolled on. Ralph visited social clubs and restaurants, where he was greeted warmly by men who remembered him from earlier decades. He attended family events, baptisms, weddings, funerals, offering envelopes and kind words, renewing his standing as both neighbor and boss. Some nights, he met quietly with representatives from New York, reassuring them that Philadelphia had steady leadership again, and that their own interests, gambling links, shared investments were safe under his watch. But inside his circle, friction grew. Younger men, thrilled by Joey's style, sometimes brushed off Ralph's caution. They wanted bigger scores, faster money, more visible status. To Ralph, their impatience looked like a path straight back to the disasters of the Scarfo years. He scolded them for unnecessary flash, but he could not turn time backward. The culture around him had changed. Television, tabloids, and changing neighborhood life all favored spectacle. This tension slowly eroded trust between the older boss and his younger partner. There were arguments about how much money flowed upward, about who controlled which union, about whether certain risky ventures, especially involving drugs, were worth it. Ralph had already served a lengthy term for narcotics. He knew how severely federal courts punished those cases. He tried to steer the family back toward gambling, unions, and business pressure. Yet the lure of quick profit from illegal substances remained strong among some members. By the late 1992, federal investigators felt they had enough to move. In June 1998, parole officers suddenly took Ralph into custody, accusing him of violating conditions by associating with known felons and engaging in forbidden activities. This grab surprised him, though he had always known returning to prison was a risk. Soon after, prosecutors unveiled broader charges tied to drug distribution and other rackets, based in large part on recordings and cooperating witnesses like Previte. Locked up again, this time as an aging man facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal custody, Ralph waited to see how his organization would react. Traditionally, when a boss went away, loyal captains and associates supported his family, paid legal fees, and showed public backing. That loyalty reinforced the idea that staying silent brought rewards, even behind bars. At first, Ralph expected exactly that. He believed Joey and the others he had helped raise to power would rally around him, send money, and keep his name honored on the street. But prison walls amplify every rumor. Through visits and news reports, he began to hear that Joey was distancing himself, that money promised to his loved ones was slow or missing, that his influence over decisions was fading quickly now that he no longer sat at the head of the table. Each sign of neglect felt like another cut. For a man whose entire identity rested on loyalty and respect within the mob, the thought that his closest ally might be leaving him to rot hit hard. At the same time, prosecutors made their position clear. They laid out the evidence they had gathered. Recordings, surveillance, testimony from insiders. They reminded him of his age, of the sentences they could seek, and of the years he had already spent behind bars. In the quiet of his cell, with long nights stretching ahead and the sense that his own people were not fighting for him the way he once would have fought for them, Ralph found himself at a crossroads he had never imagined. For decades, he had lived by the rule that you never help the government against your own. Now the government was offering him a choice: stay silent and likely die in prison, or talk and step into a role no American mafia boss had stepped into before. The decision he made would not only redefine his own life, but shake the underworld's sense of how unbreakable its codes truly were. At first, he tried to brush off the idea. In that world, you didn't even say the word cooperation aloud, not seriously. You did your time, you kept your mouth shut, and you waited for the people you'd enriched all those years to stand by your family. That was the rule Ralph Natale had lived by since he was a teenager on South Philadelphia sidewalks. But prison has a way of stripping away stories you tell yourself. Nights stretched on. He counted the cinder blocks in his cell and replayed his life like a film. He thought about the men he had followed, the orders he had carried out, the way he had pushed others to fall in line. And then he thought about the visits that weren't happening, the money that wasn't arriving, the sense that on the street his name was already fading. Prosecutors didn't rush him. They knew his type: older, proud, steeped in the code of silence. They let him sit for a while, feeling overlooked by the people he had helped put on top. When they did come, they were calm. A federal prosecutor, a couple of agents, nothing flashy. They explained, in measured tones, the charges he faced. Serious narcotics offenses, racketeering, parole violations, and hanging over everything, the possibility of additional counts tied to killings if they chose to pursue them fully. They talked about numbers, potential sentences that, given his age, added up to spending the rest of his life behind bars. They reminded him that, unlike his earlier stretches, this time he was an old man going in. Health problems would grow. The world outside would move on. He would die as just another number in the Bureau of Prisons. Then they slid the other option across the table, not as a piece of paper, but as a path. If he agreed to tell them everything, every crime he knew about, every person above and beside him who had ordered or profited from those crimes, they would consider a recommendation that could, someday, allow him to walk free again. There were no guarantees, only possibilities. But possibilities mattered when the alternative was a concrete box and a slow fade into obscurity. Ralph argued with them at first, his pride still raw. He insisted that he had been loyal his entire life. He said he had already done long years for others. He claimed that whatever he had done under a set of rules that everyone understood. The lead prosecutor listened, and then asked a simple question. If those rules were so strong, where were all the people he'd protected now? It was that question that lingered when Ralph went back to his cell. Where were they? He thought of envelopes he used to send out to imprisoned associates, of how he made sure wives and children of men who had gone away still had rent and groceries. He thought about the respect he had shown bosses above him, even when he didn't like their decisions. And now, with him locked up again, where was that same effort in return? He heard rumors that Joey had told people, he's on his own. Whether the exact words were true or not, the feeling reached him loud and clear. In the new order on the street, the old man in custody was no longer useful. One night, staring at the ceiling, he made the decision. In his mind, he flipped what the code meant. The rule had always been that you never turn on your own. But if your own had already turned away from you, if they had chosen to treat you as disposable, then what loyalty was left? He told himself he wasn't betraying a family, he was striking back at men who had thrown him aside. When he told his attorney he was ready to talk, things moved quickly. The government arranged what's known as a proffer session, a long, closed-door meeting where a potential cooperator lays out everything he can offer. They brought him into a secured room, gave him a glass of water, and switched on a recording device. Agents, a prosecutor, and his lawyer sat around the table. They reminded him that lying would destroy any chance of a deal. Then they asked him to start at the beginning. So he did. He went back to Skinny Razor's bars in South Philadelphia, to the first envelopes he carried, to the early years in the bartenders' union. He explained how union positions could be turned into engines for theft. Contractors paying extra for favorable contracts, business owners slipping cash to avoid costly labor disputes, no-show jobs created as rewards for loyal associates. He detailed schemes in which pension and benefit funds were quietly tapped, with kickbacks flowing to mob-connected officials rather than to rank-and-file workers. He walked them through the arson plots that had sent him to prison in the 1,970 seconds. Hotels and clubs, struggling with debt, were suddenly engulfed in flames. Owners collected insurance. Certain contractors got the rebuilding work, and all along the chain, pieces of the money changed hands under the table. Ralph described how properties were picked, how matches were passed off to lower-level associates, how he reported back to his superiors once a job was done. He described his move into methamphetamine operations, who had shown him the chemistry side, where labs had been set up in remote rural buildings or industrial zones, how product was distributed through mid-level dealers who paid tribute upriver. He admitted that he had watched addiction spread in the city while telling himself it was just another business line, no different from gambling or loans. Sitting in that interview room years later, he spoke about it more soberly. Agents pressed him for names, dates, locations. He gave what he could remember. Then they turned to the subject everyone in the room knew was coming: violence. Softly, in blunt terms without drama. He acknowledged that over the decades he had personally taken part in killings and had ordered others. He didn't go into gory descriptions. That wasn't what the prosecutors were after, and it wasn't necessary. What mattered was who, when, and why. Targets included a union figure seen as an obstacle to mob control, low Y-level operatives suspected of cooperating with authorities, and internal rivals whose growing independence threatened the flow of tribute to leadership. He traced one case after another, sometimes pausing to search his memory for a year or a location. In a couple of instances, he led investigators to sites long forgotten by the public patches of ground where, decades earlier, someone had been ambushed or buried. In other situations, he filled in gaps in cases that had always felt incomplete to detectives. A mysterious disappearance now had a motive. An unsolved shooting on a side street now sat within a larger pattern of internal discipline. As the days and weeks of debriefings continued, the agents learned to gauge when he was sure and when his memory blurred. He was in his 60s by then, and years in prison had worn on his health. They cross-checked his claims against old surveillance logs, financial records, phone traces, and interviews with other informants. When his stories lined up with independent evidence, their confidence in him grew. When details conflicted, they pushed him to think carefully before repeating anything. Piece by piece, they reconstructed not only Ralph's personal history, but a broader map of organized crime in Philadelphia and South Jersey from the Bruno years through Scarfo, Stanfa, and into the Merlino era. Where earlier cooperators like Sammy Gravano had opened windows into New York families, Ralph offered a rare look at another corner of the American underworld. Its smaller, often less publicized, but still lethal cousin along the Delaware River. In return, the government drafted a cooperation agreement. Ralph would plead guilty to a sweeping racketeering charge that folded in his narcotics offenses, extortion activities, union corruption, and his admitted role in multiple killings. He accepted that on paper he was confessing to a lifetime of crime. The document didn't list every small thing he had ever done that would be impossible, but it captured the most serious acts, decades of illegal business, and violence. In exchange, prosecutors would tell the sentencing judge that he had provided substantial assistance, including testimony against high-ranking figures still on the street. They weren't promising leniency. Judges in federal court made their own decisions, but a recommendation from the government carried weight. News of his cooperation leaked quickly into underworld circles and then into newspapers. Reporters labeled him the first sitting American mafia boss to become a full government witness. It caused a stir even beyond Philadelphia. If a man who had reached the top of a traditional crime family could break the code so completely, what did that say about the future of Omerta? On the street, reactions split. Some older men shook their heads, stunned that someone who had moved among legends like Angelo Bruno and Felix DeTullio would end up in a witness chair. Younger hustlers, less bound by old romantic notions, muttered that this was what happened when loyalty became a one-way street. Law enforcement officials, for their part, saw it as a historic opening. A boss had flipped. That fact alone might convince other mid-level figures in different cities to reconsider their own choices. The next phase of Ralph's life unfolded under heavy security. He was no longer held with general population. U.S. Marshals moved him carefully between secure locations. When he traveled to courthouses for pretrial hearings and, later, testimony, he did so in unmarked vehicles, flanked by armed officers. In holding cells beneath courtrooms, he waited in silence or chatted with deputy marshals, most of whom treated him as just another assignment. The big test of his value as a witness came when federal prosecutors brought a sweeping racketeering case against Joey Merlino and several associates. They accused them of running illegal gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets, and of ordering or approving violent acts as part of maintaining control. A central claim of the case was that Merlino and his circle had not just been freelance thugs, but were part of an organized structure with Ralph as boss and Joey as street leader. To prove that, the government needed someone from inside that structure to walk the jury through it. That was Ralph's job. Preparation for his time on the stand took months. Prosecutors met with him repeatedly to review what he would say. They went over his life in chronological order, checking and rechecking names, days, and relationships. They reminded him that defense lawyers would hammer at every inconsistency, every moment he seemed unsure. They coached him not to guess. If he didn't remember something precisely, he should say so. He understood the stakes. On one hand, this was his opportunity to earn the substantial assistance label that could someday help shorten his sentence. On the other, he knew that once he appeared in open court, there would be no going back. His face, his voice, his betrayal of past allies would be broadcast, printed, and remembered. Whatever reputation he still held in the underworld would be finished. When the day came, he wore plain prison attire, no expensive suits, no gold jewelry. Marshals led him into the courtroom through a side door. He glanced briefly at the defense table, where Joey and others sat in dress shirts and ties, their hair groomed, their expressions unreadable. Once they had greeted each other with embraces in South Philadelphia social clubs. Now they were divided by wooden railings, microphones, and armed security. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the witness chair. Jurors watched closely. Some had never seen a real-life mob figure before. Only movie versions. This man looked tired, older than his years, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted the microphone. The prosecutor began gently, asking about his childhood, his entry into the mob, his years with the bartenders' union. Slowly, methodically, they guided him through his own story. He described how he had risen from runner to enforcer to organizer, how he had gone to prison for arson and narcotics, how he had met Joey behind bars and formed an alliance, and how, upon release, he had been presented as the official boss while Joey ran daily operations. He admitted to acts that made the courtroom still, approving lethal attacks, overseeing methamphetamine production, shaking down businessmen. Each time he acknowledged a killing, the prosecutor pressed for the reason not the blow will be a blow, but the motive. Ralph would say that this man was suspected of skimming money, that one of cooperating with authorities, another of defying orders. For each, he accepted responsibility, sometimes as the one who carried out the attack decades earlier, sometimes as the boss who signed off on it later. He also recounted meetings with Ron Previte, unaware at the time that Previte was wearing a wire. The prosecution played recordings in which Ralph spoke about rent from bookmakers, about pressuring reluctant bar owners, about newcomers who needed to pay if they wanted to operate. Hearing his own voice echo back across the courtroom was strange. To the jury, it made his stories feel more tangible. The defense, as expected, attacked with everything they had. They painted him as a liar who had spent his life breaking laws, and now was inventing stories to save himself. They pointed out that he had only decided to cooperate when he was old, and facing another long prison term. They highlighted moments where his memory faltered, questioned his motives, and suggested that he exaggerated his own importance inside the organization. Ralph sat through hours of cross-examination. Sometimes his temper flared, and he shot back with sharp replies. Other times he seemed almost weary, repeating that he was telling what he remembered, that he couldn't change the past, only describe it. The judge occasionally reminded both sides to slow down, to let the court reporter keep up. Outside the courthouse, newspapers and television reporters framed the trial as a showdown between generations. The aging boss turned witness versus the younger street leader accused of turning Philadelphia's underworld into his own stage. Inside, for Ralph, it was both smaller and bigger. Smaller, because each day was just hours on a hard wooden seat, under bright lights, answering detailed questions. Bigger, because the words he spoke could send former allies to prison for decades. When his time on the stand finally ended, marshals led him back out through the side door. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Jurors would go on to weigh his testimony against that of other witnesses, the recordings, stacks of financial records, and arguments from both sides. Ralph returned to the quiet of protective custody, his role in this chapter finished. He had crossed a line no American mob boss before him had crossed, at least not at that level. In doing so, he had helped federal prosecutors strike deep at the structure he had once fought to build. Yet his own story was far from over. Sentencing still lay ahead, along with the long, strange experience of life as a former mafia leader now living under the government's protection, trying to reconcile the years he had spent chasing power with the lonely, confined existence that followed. Freedom the second time felt nothing like it had decades earlier. When Ralph walked out in 2011, there were no crowds from the neighborhood waiting. No young toughs eager to open car doors and carry bags. A couple of relatives helped him with paperwork and transportation. The marshals who had guarded him for years shook his hand politely and moved on to their next assignment. For the system, He was just another older inmate finishing a term. For him, it was the beginning of a strange late chapter. His first weeks outside were tightly controlled. Supervised release meant regular check-homins, strict limits on travel, and a clear warning. Any hint of contact with criminal circles could send him straight back. He understood the rules. This time, there would be no halfway steps, no quiet side schemes to make extra money the old way. He was too old, too watched, and too well known to get away with even a small slip. The world he stepped into looked familiar but felt different. South Philadelphia still had its row houses, corner stores, and churches, but newer restaurants and renovated homes had begun creeping into blocks that once held only working-class families. Younger residents walked dogs and pushed strollers along sidewalks where, in his youth, street arguments and card games had filled the evenings. Some older faces were still around, but many of the men who had run the old social clubs were either dead, in nursing homes, or serving their own long sentences. He moved carefully. Officially, he could not go back to being a neighborhood figure. Casually dropping by old haunts carried risk. Any documented meeting with known felons might be reported as a violation. So his days centered on quiet routines, medical appointments, short trips to grocery stores, visits with close family, occasional walks in places where nobody would recognize him. The first time he went into a supermarket after release, he stopped in the doorway for a moment, overwhelmed by the bright lights and endless aisles. Years earlier, his power had come from knowing every bar on certain streets and every union official in specific offices. Now, scanning shelves full of cereal brands and bottled drinks he had never seen before, he realized how much of ordinary life he had missed while chasing control over hidden money flows. He was in his mid-70s, and his body reminded him daily of the miles he had put on it. Old injuries, prison mattresses, stress, and age had stiffened his joints and weakened his back. Doctors prescribed pills with names he could barely pronounce. He did physical therapy exercises in small apartments instead of pacing prison yards. Freedom brought its own set of aches. Family ties, strained by decades of raids, court hearings, and headlines, took time to rebuild. Some relatives welcomed him with cautious warmth. They had grown up watching him disappear into trials and disappear again into custody, hearing his name shouted on television alongside words like killer and turncoat. Now, seeing him sit quietly at a kitchen table, passing plates and asking about school or work, felt almost unreal. He tried to talk less about the old days when young children were in the room. Years earlier, he would have worn his history like a badge, telling half-coded stories about standing next to feared men and taking care of business. After so much time inside, and after facing victims' families in courtrooms, he knew there was less to be proud of than he had once believed. He still spoke in the blunt, rough language of someone who had never moved far from South Philadelphia streets, but he held back on celebrating past violence. With adults, including some of his grown children and extended relatives, the conversations were harder. Some wanted to understand why he had chosen that life in the first place. Others, especially those who had absorbed insults in school or at work because of his reputation, carried quiet resentment. He listened more than he used to. He tried to explain how, in his youth, organized crime had seemed like the only real avenue to power and respect in a neighborhood where legitimate paths felt blocked. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted them to know he hadn't set out to ruin anyone's life. At the same time, outside interest in him remained. Journalists who had followed mob trials for decades knew that an Exio boss who turned witness did not simply vanish into suburbia. Reporters reached out, some directly, some through intermediaries, asking if he would talk on the record now that his cooperation deal had run its course. True crime writers and documentary producers also circled. The American fascination with organized crime had not faded. If anything, new generations discovered the subject through films, television dramas, and podcasts, often blurring the line between fiction and fact. At first, he declined most approaches. Speaking to agents and prosecutors in secure rooms was one thing. Sitting down with interviewers whose words would be broadcast worldwide was another. There were safety concerns, but there was also the question of how he wanted to frame his story. For decades, law enforcement, newspapers, and rival mob figures had shaped his public image. If he talked, he wanted to do it on his own terms. He did, however, accept occasional invitations to speak to groups linked with law enforcement and legal training. Some federal and local agencies saw value in bringing in a former high-level figure to explain, from the inside, how unions had been compromised, how extortion fees were collected, how leadership struggled to balance profit and secrecy. Under controlled circumstances, he addressed rooms of investigators, prosecutors, and analysts. He talked about how easy it had been, in earlier decades, to slide from legitimate bargaining into criminal pressure inside labor groups. He described the way business owners often convinced themselves that paying small, regular sums to stay protected was simpler than calling police and risking retaliation. He outlined the process of grooming younger associates, first simple errands, then collections, then more serious assignments, always with the understanding that silence and obedience would be rewarded. These appearances were not glamorous. They took place in conference rooms rather than grand halls, with coffee in styrofoam cups rather than wine in stemware. He wore ordinary clothes, loose shirts to accommodate his aging frame, plain trousers, scuffed shoes. Some in the audience saw him as a cautionary tale. Others saw him as a useful, if morally compromised, source of practical insight. As time passed and his health stabilized somewhat, he became more open to the idea of cooperating on a book. The notion appealed to both his ego and his desire to leave behind something more complex than the headlines that had reduced him to a handful of labels. A veteran New York journalist, Larry McShane, and crime investigator Dan Pearson eventually partnered to shape his recollections into a narrative. They met him repeatedly, recording hours of conversation. Those sessions required him to revisit nearly every stage of his life. He talked about growing up in row houses, his early admiration for men like Angelo Bruno and Skinny Razor, his rise through union ranks, the methamphetamine cases, the long prison stints, his time as recognized leader of the Philadelphia organization, and his decision to cooperate. He told stories he had told privately for years, but now understood would be printed between covers and placed on shelves for strangers to judge. The authors checked his claims against court records, FBI files, and other sources. Where documents supported his version, they felt more secure, including it. Where discrepancies appeared, they made choices about how to present events, sometimes flagging disagreements in quiet ways for careful readers. Even so, once word spread that he was involved in a book, familiar arguments broke out in legal circles, and among people who followed organized crime closely. Some federal agents who had worked Philadelphia cases took the position that, while Ralph had given them accurate insight on many matters, he also had a tendency to place himself at the center of every major event. They respected the value of his cooperation, but doubted certain stories in which he portrayed himself as the deciding figure behind pivotal decisions. A few reporters who had covered trials for years wrote that he was reliable on the big picture, slippery on details. Within remaining criminal circles, reactions were sharper. Men who had once served in the ranks dismissed the idea that he had been a fully independent and powerful boss. To them, he had been more of a compromise leader, someone installed partly to reassure older East Coast hierarchies while a younger generation, led by Merlino, ran most daily business. From that perspective, his claim in the upcoming book title to be "The Last Don Standing" sounded inflated. Ralph, hearing these criticisms, stuck to his view. He insisted that, during the years after his release from his long narcotics term, he had indeed held the formal honors of leadership, met directly with other bosses, and made final calls on life-out-and-death decisions. He admitted that Joey had dominated the street and attracted younger followers, but he maintained that without his own name and status, Joey would never have gained the acceptance he did from older heads. In 2017, the finished volume appeared. A memoir-style account told largely in his voice, organized and shaped by McShane and Pearson. The title presented him as a relic of a fading era. Inside, readers found a blend of self-portrait, crime history, and personal justification. He recounted arson plots, labor scams, narcotics operations, and homicides in broad strokes, avoiding gruesome detail but acknowledging responsibility. He also described his choice to help the government as a necessary response to betrayal, painting himself as a man following a warped but consistent personal logic. Reviews were mixed. Some praised the book for its first-hand look at the Philadelphia organization across several decades, noting that few surviving participants at his level had spoken so openly. Others criticized it as self-serving and incomplete, pointing out that he often glossed over the deepest harms his actions had caused. Victims' families in particular felt that any portrayal that allowed him to seem reflective or philosophical risked softening the brutal reality of what he and his associates had done. For Ralph, the publication delivered a brief return to public view. He gave interviews to newspapers, radio hosts, and television programs interested in crime stories. Sitting on simple chairs under studio lights, he told the same arc again and again. Poor kid, early admiration for powerful local figures, decades in organized crime, final break with the code of silence. Journalists asked about famous names. They asked whether he feared retaliation. They asked if he regretted cooperating. He usually answered that he did not fear much anymore. He was, after all, an elderly man with failing health, living in an era when the structure he had once belonged to was a shadow of itself. He said the people who might have wanted revenge were either gone or too old to bother. As for regret, he separated his choices in two categories. He sometimes expressed sorrow for the pain he had caused families of people his crew had harmed, but when asked if he regretted helping the government, he shook his head. In his telling, the betrayal had started when his own side left him alone in a cell and stopped caring whether he lived or died. Behind the scenes, his day-to-day existence remained modest. There were no luxury cars, no fancy dinners paid for with house envelopes, no constant stream of visitors. Money from the book was limited. Publishing true crime work about a single regional figure in the 21st century did not generate the fortunes that people often imagine. After legal fees, agent percentages, and taxes, what remained helped with ordinary bills more than it created wealth. He lived quietly in New Jersey in his later years, far from the buzz of South Philadelphia barrooms and Atlantic City boardwalks. Neighbors occasionally recognized his name from news articles or television segments, then did double takes when they saw the frail man moving slowly to his mailbox or getting into a car for a doctor's appointment. The contrast between the aging grandfather figure on the sidewalk and the harsh descriptions in old headlines was striking. Even into his 80s, he spoke periodically with law enforcement figures and researchers interested in the long arc of organized crime in America. They asked him not only about specific crimes, but about the culture that had shaped men like him. How did codes of loyalty and silence take hold so deeply? Why had so many in his generation accepted prison as a normal occupational risk? What did they think would be waiting for them at the end of their working lives? He answered that, in the world he grew up in, respect from street peers had counted more than respect from society at large. Being known as someone who did what had to be done carried more weight than a title at a legitimate company. In those neighborhoods, men boasted about time served the way others boasted about promotions. The promise, spoken or unspoken, was that loyalty would be rewarded when age finally caught up with envelopes, with protection, with a place at the table, even when you couldn't do much anymore. In his case, that promise had failed. Sitting in small rooms in anonymous buildings, he told interviewers that young people needed to see that reality clearly. He insisted that whatever glamour people still attached to old-style mob life belonged more to movies than to actual streets. Real life in that world meant constant fear of betrayal, regular risk of arrest, and the near certainty that, sooner or later, someone you considered a friend would put their own survival ahead of yours. Health problems gradually narrowed his world further. Trips outside became rarer. Phone calls replaced face-health conversations. The same past that had once made him an object of fascination now existed mostly in old court transcripts, worn news clippings, and copies of his book stacked on shelves. Younger law enforcement officers entering the field after his main trials had ended sometimes recognized his name vaguely, but had not followed his cases in real time. He was becoming, even to police and prosecutors, part of history rather than an active figure. Yet the choices he had made, both in committing crimes and in later testifying, still rippled outward. Families of men he had helped convict continued to visit federal institutions on visiting days. Children of some of his victims were middle-aged by now, carrying memories of funerals held long ago. Former associates who had refused to cooperate counted the years left on their sentences and compared their fate with his. Scholars studying the decline of traditional organized crime families cited his decision to switch sides as one of several crucial blows that had weakened the old structures. He lived long enough to see the criminal landscape change in ways he could never have imagined when he first carried envelopes for Skinny Razor. Cybercrime rings, international fraud networks, street gangs with different routes. All these newer threats drew much of the attention that had once been focused on families like the one he had belonged to. His life story, from 1000 930 Seconds Philadelphia Childhood Through Union Rackets, Methamphetamine Schemes, Leadership, and Cooperation, came to look less like a current case file and more like a long cautionary chapter in the history of American organized crime. In private moments, sitting alone in a chair near a window, he was left with his thoughts. He had outlived many of the men who had recruited, taught, and trusted him. He had walked free when others who never broke the code remained caged. He had told his side of the story in courtrooms and on paper. The only questions left were the ones no agent, writer, or lawyer could fully answer. What, if anything, he felt when he replayed certain nights in his mind, and whether any amount of later cooperation or reflection could balance the scale of a life spent climbing a ladder built from fear and silence. In the years after his book appeared, the phones rang less and the days stretched longer. The initial buzz around an old mob boss telling his tale faded, replaced by newer scandals and different names. For Ralph, that quiet suited him more than he would have admitted in his younger years. In the past, he had craved motion. Meetings in back rooms, whispered conferences in parked cars, late-night calls from men with problems that needed fixing. Now, in a modest home in New Jersey, his world narrowed to family visits, doctor appointments, and occasional conversations with people who still wanted to understand the life he had left behind. He woke early most mornings, a habit built during years of prison counts and early chow lines. Coffee, pills, a slow walk to the window. He watched cars move along ordinary streets, parents dropping kids at school, neighbors taking out trash. It struck him how normal most people's routines were. When he had been their age, his mornings had already involved phone calls about collections, sit-downs, or news that someone had been picked up overnight. Trouble had arrived before lunch, almost as a given. Television filled many of his afternoons. He flicked through channels showing crime dramas, documentaries, and news panels. Sometimes he stumbled onto programs about organized crime that used old footage from his era. Grainy shots of Angelo Bruno walking past cameras, mugshots of Scarfo and Stanfa, courtroom sketches of Merlino. Once in a while, an image of his own face would flash a photograph taken as he entered a courthouse in handcuffs years earlier, or a still from a recent interview he had given. Seeing himself this way felt strange, like looking at a character rather than his own reflection. What puzzled him most was how entertainment had taken pieces of real life and turned them into myths. Series and films portrayed underworld figures as tortured anti-heroes, their crimes wrapped in dramatic music and clever dialogue. Viewers rooted for them, or at least found them fascinating. He knew that, in reality, the work had been more tedious and ugly. Long hours in smoky rooms counting money, relentless suspicion of everyone around you, constant fear that a single wrong word on a wiretap could bring down an entire structure. When documentaries asked him about the gap between fiction and reality, he always came back to the same point. Nobody on a screen ever captured how lonely it felt at the top when everything started falling apart. Around him, the world of organized crime changed shape. Old-style families, like the one he had belonged to, shrank under years of prosecutions and new types of competition. Drugs, gambling, and extortion still existed, but control no longer flowed as cleanly through a single chain of command. Street gangs, independent crews, and international groups, linked through phones and computers, took a bigger share of illegal markets. For young men who wanted quick money and status, the path he had followed through neighborhood social clubs, union halls, and pledges of lifelong loyalty no longer looked like the obvious route. Philadelphia itself continued to feel the aftershocks of the years he had helped shape. After Joey's federal conviction in the late 1990 seconds, an older figure, Joe Legambi, had stepped in quietly to steady the family. Later, Legambi and others were brought to trial, then saw some charges dropped and others end without convictions. Joey eventually returned to the streets, then, years later, faced new federal gambling accusations out of New York. That later case ended in a plea to a relatively minor charge tied to illegal betting, far removed from the sweeping racketeering counts that had once threatened to bury him for life. Ralph followed these developments from afar, reading articles, occasionally taking phone calls from reporters asking for his take. He rarely spoke freely about the men still active. He had already crossed enough lines. He had no interest in becoming a running commentator on every new arrest. When he did respond, he kept it short, saying that the old days were gone and that anyone still chasing that life now did so in a very different, much smaller arena. Within law enforcement, his name still carried weight in certain circles. Agents who had come up studying the Scarfo and Merlino years used his story as a case study for recruits. In training classes, instructors explained how long it had taken to persuade someone at his height to cooperate, how agents had patiently built a relationship, documented his claims, and cross-checked them against independent evidence. They played short clips from his testimony to show new prosecutors how a witness with a criminal past might sound on the stand. Blunt, abrasive at times, but capable of putting complex schemes into plain language. Gradually, requests reached him to speak not just to investigators but also to wider audiences, law students, criminal justice majors, community groups interested in the history of crime in their region. Some events were formal, with microphones and stage lights. Others took place in small lecture rooms where a few dozen people gathered. At these talks, he sat on a simple chair, often beside a moderator who guided the conversation. He told those audiences about small decisions that didn't look like much at the time: the choice to run an errand for an older man instead of going straight home after school, the decision to keep quiet about an assault he had witnessed instead of calling police, the moment he found it easier to accept easy money from illegal operations than to grind away at a low-paying legitimate job. None of those steps felt like turning points then. Only looking back could he see how each one closed off other options. Even when he spoke frankly, he resisted painting himself as completely reformed. He knew that some people wanted a clean redemption story. The feared boss who discovered conscience and devoted his later years to making amends. His own reality was messier. He remained, at core, the same stubborn man who had made hard choices according to a personal code, then rewritten that code when he felt others had betrayed it. He did not pretend that a handful of speeches or a book could erase decades of harm. Critics remained vocal. Other former mob figures who had also cooperated, people who had pleaded guilty in their own cases, and then testified for the government, questioned his version of events. Some claimed he overstated his authority during the years he and Joey worked together, arguing that he had been more of a figurehead than a fully independent leader. Retired agents and organized crime reporters who had spent years tracking tapes, surveillance, and informant reports wrote articles dissecting his claims, comparing them with archived files. Ralph saw those pieces, sometimes in print, sometimes online. They annoyed him, but he understood why they existed. Everyone in his world had always fought over status, even when chains and charges had replaced handshakes and envelopes. From his chair, he held to one simple assertion: that during the mid-1990 seconds, when he emerged from his long sentence and joined forces with Joey, he had indeed been recognized by other families as the boss, with the final say over life, death, and money. Whether others accepted that picture or saw him as inflating his importance no longer changed his daily routine. Still, he repeated it whenever interviewers asked. As his 80th birthday approached, questions of legacy took up more space in his head. Not the legacy of headlines or book titles, but the effect his life had had on the people who shared his blood. Some grandchildren knew him mostly as an old relative, with a rough voice and a body full of old injuries. Others, particularly those living in the Philadelphia area, had grown up hearing his name in whispered conversations, in news clips replayed when fresh mob cases broke, in stories from older relatives who had lived through the peak years. During private conversations at kitchen tables or in quiet living rooms, they sometimes asked what advice he would give them. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told them straight that chasing street reputation was a dead end, that the skills he had once used to climb inside the underworld, reading people, negotiating, staying calm under pressure, would have done far more good in legitimate businesses. He urged them to stay away from anyone promising shortcuts to money or respect through illegal work. If someone offered them a no-show job or cash to look after a small gambling operation, he told them to walk away. Whether he fully believed that message deep down or saw it as required talk in his new role didn't matter to those listening. For younger relatives, hearing it from him carried weight. The man who had once done everything possible to keep them inside a protective circle of his influence now told them clearly that the entire circle had been a trap. Outside his family, a small community of crime historians, writers, and podcasters continued to examine his story. New long-form pieces appeared from time to time, reflecting on his cooperation in the context of the broader collapse of American mafia structures. Scholars pointed out that his decision combined with the turn of other high-ranking figures in different cities, had damaged not just individual families, but the broader myth of unbreakable loyalty that had kept many younger members in line. They contrasted his generation's pathway into crime with its emphasis on local loyalty, tight neighborhoods, and lifelong affiliation with newer forms of organized lawbreaking, driven by anonymous online networks and rapid, fluid alliances. For them, Ralph's life represented a bridge between older, face-and-hover-face criminal organizations and a world where most conspiracy unfolded over keyboards rather than at club tables. He read some of these analyses when they were mailed to him or when someone printed them from the internet. He shook his head at phrases like historical figure and representative of a bygone era. To him, it had simply been living, one decision after another. The idea that graduate students in distant universities might someday write theses with his name in footnotes would have baffled the young man hustling on South 8th Street. Despite the reflection and commentary, ordinary practical concerns still framed his late years. Medical bills, household costs, transportation to appointments, all the things that millions of retirees manage weighed on him and those around him. Unlike many former corporate bosses or successful entrepreneurs, he had no comfortable pension or large savings account built from legitimate work. The money he had earned in his criminal prime had gone to lawyers, fines, seized assets, families of associates, and the daily churn of living above his means. Whatever small sums arrived from his book and media work reduced strain but did not erase it. He spent more time indoors as time passed. Winters hit harder, his lungs protesting in cold air that once barely bothered him. He watched the weather from behind sealed panes, thinking back to nights when snow had muffled gunshots and police sirens, when he and others had driven through slick streets on urgent, illegal business. Now he shuffled from room to room, careful on each step. Time does to everyone what law enforcement could only try to do: slow them down, regardless of how tough they once believed themselves to be. Occasionally, someone would recognize his name in a waiting room or at a pharmacy counter. A middle-aged man might approach, say he had grown up hearing stories about Natale and Merlino, and ask if he was really that Ralph. He would nod, usually keeping the exchange brief. These interactions carried an odd mix of awe and awkwardness. The people asking questions had never known the fear his name once inspired in certain neighborhoods. For them, he was more like a story character suddenly stepping off a page. He felt the distance between myth and reality most sharply in those moments. The man they pictured confident, surrounded by loyal soldiers, making decisive calls with a flick of his hand, stood a long way from the man leaning on a cane, reminding himself to take his medication on time. If there was any lesson in that contrast, he hoped it might sink in quietly. Power built on intimidation rarely survives the passage of years. What remains is whatever relationships you managed not to destroy along the way. Through it all, the question of whether he had done the right thing by cooperating remained open to everyone but him. Law enforcement officials who had relied on his testimony defended the value of his choice, pointing to reduced mob activity and successful prosecutions. Families of some victims saw him as a man who had escaped full punishment by turning on others late in life. Old associates who had refused to cut deals viewed him as a traitor who had walked free while they aged in cells. In his own mind, the matter had been settled the day he decided that the men he had put in power would not do for him what he had always done for his mentors. He did not expect forgiveness from those he had harmed or admiration from those who had stayed silent. He wanted only to live out his remaining time without bars around him and to say, in whatever forms would listen, that the life he had once sold to younger men as the pinnacle of success had in fact led him to isolation, disappointment, and, eventually, a witness chair. As the decade turned and headlines filled with new crises, his story slipped further into the background. Still, on certain nights, a documentary rerun or a podcast episode would bring his name back into living rooms and earbuds. A younger viewer or listener might pause the program and search him online, finding court transcripts, opinion pieces, and photos of an older man in courtroom lighting. They would see the broad outline mob boss, cooperator, author, and perhaps wonder how such a life actually felt from the inside. By then, the only person who fully knew that feeling was spending most of his days in a small space, moving slowly between chair and bed, window and door, carrying memories that had shaped not just his own fate, but a wide swath of Philadelphia's hidden history. In those last years, his days settled into a slow, predictable rhythm. He woke before dawn, more from habit than from any need to be up early. Years of head counts and clangs of cell doors had trained his body to rise when the sky was still dark. Now, instead of guards' footsteps, the sounds were softer. A refrigerator humming, a car starting, somewhere outside, the shuffle of a neighbor taking a dog out. He moved carefully, gripping furniture or leaning on a cane, making his way to a small kitchen. Coffee, toast, a handful of pills lined up beside a glass of water. When he sat at the table, he sometimes spread out old newspapers, reading stories 3 or 4 days out of date. It didn't matter. The world moved faster than he did anyway. The phone rang less often, but it still rang. A child or grandchild checking in. A writer working on a larger history of East Coast organized crime, asking a specific question about a long-ago union meeting or a name mentioned in a transcript. An old acquaintance calling to say another figure from their era had passed. Each call about a death chipped away a little more of the world he had once known. One by one, men whose names had filled FBI files and city gossip disappeared, not in alleyways or car ambushes, but in hospitals and care homes. He understood that pattern well. He had survived the years when internal feuds and street rivalries killed quickly. Now time itself was finishing the work. The last Don Standing phrase on his book's cover had been partly a sales hook, but in a literal sense it contained truth. Few of the people who had held real rank during the Bruno and Scarfo periods remained alive by the late 2010 seconds. Those who did were frail and out of the life. Some afternoons he would sit in an armchair near a window and drift back across the decades. He thought about the union hall where he had first learned to twist legitimate bargaining into a weapon. He replayed the nights when he had received news of murders, sometimes with satisfaction, sometimes with relief that a perceived threat had been removed. Looking back, he could see something he had barely grasped then. How each act of violence, even when it seemed to solve a situation inside the organization, created new resentments and trauma beyond it. Faces bothered him more than events. He remembered mothers crying outside churches, wives clutching folded flags at burials, children staring at grown-ups who refused to explain why someone was never coming home again. In the years when he believed completely in the world he served, he had pushed those images aside. After prison, after cooperation, alone with his thoughts, they resurfaced. He never tried to reinvent himself as a saint. When interviewers, especially toward the end, tried to steer him toward a neat story of repentance and redemption, he pushed back. He said plainly that he had lived much of his life as a criminal, had ordered and committed serious crimes, and had then decided very late to help the government. He did not pretend that this erased what came before. All it did was give prosecutors more tools and him a way out of dying behind bars. A few times, younger reporters asked him if there had been one moment when he knew he would change sides. He usually went back to the same answer. The absence of support when he was locked up in 1998, no money for his family, no sign that the people he had helped to the top were willing to pay even a small part of the price he was now facing. To him, that had meant the unwritten agreement at the heart of organized crime was already broken. Everything he did afterward flowed from that realization. In these conversations, he also tried to strip away the shine people still attached to his old life. He talked about the constant fear of listening devices, the way every dinner in a restaurant turned into a surveillance concern, the nightmare of living with the knowledge that someone you saw as a friend might already be talking to agents. He described long prison stretches where days blurred and families struggled, where the bravado of the street meant very little when you lay awake in a bunk counting years instead of dollars. When he told students or community groups that there was nothing glamorous at the end of that road, he meant himself. There he was, an elderly man in thick glasses, moving slowly, reliant on medication, watched over by a small circle of relatives instead of a tight ring of bodyguards. Whatever power he had once wielded existed only in old paperwork and television archives. In his living room, the only things fearfully obeying him were the stubborn aches in his legs when he stood up too fast. As the 2020 decade began, his health declined more noticeably. Breathing sometimes came hard. Hospital visits grew more frequent. Routine checkups turned into long stays, while doctors adjusted treatments and ran scans. Nurses learned his background from chart notes or from whispers at the station desk. Some were curious, some indifferent. Most treated him like any other older patient needing help sitting up, help shuffling to the bathroom, help understanding complicated instructions. Those hospital rooms, with their white walls and television sets hanging from ceilings, reminded him in odd ways of the quieter parts of prison. Structured days, fluorescent lights, institutional food, strangers coming and going on schedules. Lying awake at night with machines humming beside the bed, he had time to weigh the distance he had traveled from bars in South Philadelphia, thick with cigarette smoke, to sterile wards, with alarms that beeped if he tried to stand too quickly. Family visited when they could, bringing magazines, small snacks the doctors would allow, and stories from outside. They showed him photos on phones, graduations, holidays, ordinary gatherings he couldn't attend. He listened more than he spoke. The old impulse to steer every conversation toward his own exploits slowly faded. Hearing about a child's good report card or a new job for a nephew brought him a quieter satisfaction than recounting a successful shakedown ever had. In quieter moments, some relatives asked gentler questions than journalists ever did. Did he wish he had chosen differently as a young man? If he had worked a straight job, would he have been content? He answered in a way that reflected both honesty and stubbornness. Part of him believed that his nature, his drive for control, his readiness to take risks, would always have pushed him towards something intense, whether criminal or legitimate. Another part of him admitted that if someone had convinced him in his teens that there were real opportunities outside the world of social clubs and connected men, he might have seen a different path. He never completely escaped the old tendency to see himself as a man who had simply played the hand his circumstances dealt him. Yet age, illness, and solitude softened that view. He acknowledged that, even with all the pressures of his background, many people from the same streets had chosen other lives, working trades, opening shops, becoming teachers or civil servants. They had felt the same frustrations and temptations he had, yet refused to step across certain lines. In that light, he could no longer blame everything on the neighborhood or the era. As his story spread through books and broadcasts, some of the people most deeply affected by his actions responded in their own ways. Children of men he had helped send to prison spoke in documentaries about growing up visiting fathers through thick glass, about reconciling love for a parent with knowledge of what that parent had done. Relatives of victims described the pain of watching the man who admitted approving or participating in those killings walk out of custody before some of the non-cooperating defendants did. Ralph was aware of that anger. He had heard it in courtrooms when victims' families made statements. He knew that for them, his cooperation looked less like justice and more like a trade. Testimony for reduced punishment. No words could fully answer that feeling. When asked about it late in life, he did not argue. He simply said that the system had made a bargain with him to dismantle larger structures, and that he had accepted it. Whether that bargain seemed fair depended on where you. Saturday. In early 2022, time finally did what no competitor, no prosecutor, and no rival crew had managed. After a period of worsening health, Ralph Natale died at 86. News of his passing appeared in obituaries and crime columns, often framed by the same key points. First, modern American mafia boss, to become a full federal witness, admitted participant in multiple killings, former Philadelphia area leader, whose decision to cooperate had rocked underworld assumptions about loyalty. Those short pieces tried to compress 80-plus years into a few columns. Birth in South Philadelphia in 1935, early service under Skinny Razor and others, climb through union influence and narcotics, long federal sentence, alliance with Joey Merlino, brief stint as recognized boss, arrest, cooperation, high-profile testimony, eventual release, lady life memoir. They mentioned his children, noted where he had spent his final years, and closed with a summary line about his place in organized crime history. In the neighborhoods where he had once held real sway, reactions were muted. Younger residents, walking dogs past row houses and new cafes, barely knew his name. Older people who remembered the Bruno and Scarfo eras shrugged or repeated stories they had heard secondhand. That he had been tough, that he had turned, that in the end he'd outlived many of the men who cursed him. For some, his death felt like another page turning in a book that had already been mostly written by court cases and changing times. Law enforcement veterans who had pursued his generation of criminals saw his passing more as a marker than a shock. Many had expected it for years, watching as age thinned the ranks of the people they once surveilled day and night. Some reflected publicly on the odd relationship that had developed between them and the man who had once treated them as enemies. After his cooperation, They had come to rely on his memory and his willingness to talk. They had seen him not as a friend, but as someone whose choices had, in a complicated way, aligned with their mission near the end. For those trying to learn from his story, the lessons lay less in the headlines about being a Don and more in the long trail of consequences behind them. Every step he took deeper into the life brought money and influence in the short term, but also greater risk, more hidden enemies, more pain for anyone connected to him. Each time he followed an order to punish someone fiercely, or gave such orders himself, he widened a circle of suffering that reached far beyond the narrow calculations of mob politics. His decision to testify later did help dismantle systems that preyed on workers, business owners, and neighborhoods. It put dangerous people behind bars and discouraged future recruits from seeing the mafia as an untouchable path to power. Yet that turn did not erase the harm that had already been done. It simply meant that, in his final decades, he spent more time talking to agents, lawyers, and students than to bookmakers, union officials, or frightened bar managers. In the end, his life traced a full arc through the world of organized crime. From fascinated boy watching sharper-dressed men on South Philadelphia streets, to trusted operative and union manipulator, to narcotics offender serving long time, to acknowledged head of a battered crime family, to government witness, and finally to aging man in a quiet house, looking back on decisions made in the heat of ambition and fear. For people hearing his story at bedtime, as a long narrative told softly in the dark, the point is not to turn him into a frightening legend or a tragic hero. It is to see how early choices, left unquestioned, can lead a person far from anything resembling a peaceful old age. The respect he once chased came at a cost he could not fully measure until it was too late to repair. On a night years after his passing, someone might walk through South Philadelphia and see little sign of the world that shaped him. A few old social clubs with dark windows, churches still holding services, families gathering around dinner tables. Whatever presence he once had on those blocks now lives mostly in court records, worn news footage, and the memories of those who knew him. The boy who once believed power in that setting would keep his loved ones safe, instead spent much of his life behind walls and the rest under a cloud of controversy. The man who rose to command fear ended his days dependent on nurses and doctors, his stories filtered through recording devices and book pages. If his life holds any lasting meaning beyond criminal history, it lies in showing that the shortcuts to power and money offered by organized crime do not lead to lasting security, but to loss, loneliness, and, eventually, a quiet exit watched by very few. As the story of Ralph Natale draws to a close, what remains for anyone listening is a long, uneasy picture of how a kid from ordinary streets can be pulled into extraordinary wrongdoing, how loyalties built on fear can crumble when tested, and how even the highest-ranking figures in hidden worlds cannot escape the simple truth that every choice, sooner or later, brings a reckoning. And with that, we close tonight's chapter of The Silent Empires. Ralph Natale here, thanking you for walking with me through the loyalty, the strategy, and the quiet power that shaped my path in Philadelphia's underworld. If this story helped you unwind or drift toward sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the calm of the night rest softly around you, and may the echoes of history guide you gently into sleep. Good night.